Welcome again. Thanks for being here. It's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker at this conference, Bernard Yack. As I said at the beginning of the conference, this is an interdisciplinary institute where interdisciplinarity is taken very seriously, both on the level of teaching and on the level of research. However, we are holding a conference strongly overpopulated by historians. And so I felt it was a good idea to have a non-historian deliver his keynote to us, not only, as I said earlier, as a nod to the Institute's interdisciplinarity, but also for a few more specific reasons. And these are that historians in the concert of the social sciences perhaps have a tendency, other social scientists say, to answer every question they're being asked with, "It depends." And so there's this virtue of history, which is its time and place sensitivity. Which I do think, those of you who know me, is a virtue, but which can also have its dangers. And Bernard Yack is the person I thought was the right antidote for this danger. And this danger at this conference is that we historians continue to speak about lots of different contexts and settings in which everything depends on time and place specificity, and we have all these nationalisms proliferate, as we did this morning, with at some point being no longer sure what exactly we mean by the terms that we are using. And this is where a political theorist comes in, which is Bernard Yack, who can help us, I think, with some clarification of terms in relation to nationalism. And I chose him for this because reading some of his writings when studying nationalism, in particular historical contexts, has been a revelation to me. In particular, his writings about the relationship between popular sovereignty, so the notional investment of sovereignty in the people, and its relationship with nationalism. And you correct me if I misconstrue your argument, but the way I understood this is to say that nationalism follows on the heels of the spread of popular sovereignty, because the notion that sovereignty comes from the people obliges people to make an argument about the pre-political roots of community, and this argument is essentially nationalism. Right, so without further ado, I give the floor to him. I'm very grateful to have him with us. Bernard Yack is the Lerman Neubauer Professor of Democracy and Public Policy at Brandeis University. He was a student of Judith Shklar. He taught at Harvard University, Princeton University, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Is the author of many books, one of which that should be cited, of course, and it was his first book, is The Longing for Total Revolution, Philosophic Sources of Social Discontent from Rousseau to Marx and Nietzsche, published apparently 10 years after you first came to Geneva, you said, namely in 1986. I don't know, for studying Rousseau, you may have spent all of the 10 years here. But so this was your first book. I won't cite them all. A long series of them followed afterwards, of which the most relevant perhaps to our conference here was one published in 2012 by the University of Chicago Press, entitled Nationalism and the Moral Psychology of Community. So I'm very glad you made it all the way to come here. I'm very grateful, and without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Miko, and thank all of you for hanging in there. It's a long day. I appreciate your stamina, and if you're wilting a little bit, I forgive you. I'll probably wilt a little bit too. This is the first time for me speaking in front of real people, giving a real lecture in 18 months. And bear with me if I've forgotten how to do it. I'll try to get back into shape here. And I'm especially grateful for the invitation to come here. and this opportunity to return to academic engagement at this conference and in this wonderful city. I'm sure it's the first time back for many of you, enjoying and adjusting to human beings. So I decided not to dwell on the most depressing aspects of our subject, those that have to do with contemporary politics. Instead, I'll focus on what I think is as the most distinctive feature of nationhood. It's sine qua non. Maybe we'll do it better standing back. Okay, can you hear me here? No. Okay, I got to get closer. I just hear this ringing. Okay. Maybe this one works better. Does this work? Oh, good. Okay, this one works better. No? Okay, forget about it. Anyway, I'm going to focus instead on what I think of as the sine qua non, the most distinctive feature of the experience of nationalism, you might say, a way of imagining our existence in time, hence my Heideggerian-sounding title being In Time. Don't worry, that's the last time I'll talk about Heidegger. For this, I believe, is what makes the nation such a shapeshifter, or political Proteus, as it's described in the title of the conference. Now, as Michal said, I'm a political theorist, and thank you for allowing me to crash your conference of historians. Political theory is, you might think of as a child of a marriage between philosophy and history. And it can be a happy marriage, or it can be an unhappy marriage, an unhappy home, or a happy home, because there's a lot of competition in there between the parents, philosophers wanting to find and identify the underlying truth behind things, the commonality, and historians always saying, no, it's different. My case study shows there's something another way of doing it, or we can't really accept that organizing dichotomy. I say this in order to prepare you for what I'm going to talk about today, which has to do with the way in which we conceptualize nationhood. You're probably all familiar with those frustrating opening chapters of books on nationalism, where they go into these definitional arguments about the concept of the nation, throwing out this and then that feature. No, it's not language. No, it's not the state. No, it's not this. No, it's not that. And then ends up throwing up their hands in the air and saying, no, a nation is a group that thinks it's a nation. And what kind of group is it thinking of itself when it thinks of itself as a nation? A nation, which is a group that thinks of itself as a nation, and on and on and on. Okay. Now, that kind of chapter and that kind of infinite regress argument is sort of frustrating when you come on it from a historian. But when it's coming from a political theorist, it's an admission of defeat. No good. You have to address that question. It's not just annoying. It's an admission of failure. You have to try to answer that what is question. And so with that, you're prepared for what I'm going to try to do. Okay. The most famous 20th century definition of the nation describes it as an imagined community, a group whose mutual connections are imagined as bounded and sovereign over some particular territory. Benedict Anderson's characterization of nations as imagined communities was important because it helped us focus our attention on how we imagine connections to people who are not present and with whom we do not directly interact. Something we surely need to do in order to make sense of large impersonal groups like the nation. But it's limited, as I think Anderson himself recognized in the book, by its focus on how we imagine our connections to people who are distant to us in space. What makes a national community in this definition is an imagined connection to people who are thought to possess the final authority, sovereignty, within the boundaries of a particular stretch of territory. Now, we can reasonably argue and disagree about whether claims to sovereignty should be included in one's definition of the nation. I think it's a mistake. But it seems clear to me, absolutely clear to me, that this definition leaves out something crucial to the experience of nationhood: the sense of imagined connection over time, connection to people who do not necessarily dwell in the present, as well as people who do not dwell in our presence. This sense of imagined connection over time gives the experience of nationhood what Steve Grosby aptly describes as its temporal depth, the intergenerational resonances that deepen and often complicate our sense of connection to members of national communities. Now, to be clear, this is a sense of imagined connection within or through a particular stretch of time, not a sense of connection that transcends time, like that felt by, say, Stoics, who imagine themselves part of a cosmopolitan community governed by eternal laws of nature. Unlike groups connected by their imagined possessions of timeless truths, nations are imagined as bounded in time as well as in space. Their members, I'll suggest, imagine themselves connected to people who share a particular path through time, an imagined line on a time map, you might say. And we're bound to misunderstand the problems that nations pose for us as long as we ignore or take for granted this feature of the experience of nationhood. Now, I'm keenly aware that I'm a political theorist addressing a group of historians, and therefore it might seem a little bit ridiculous for me to come up here and insist that you, of all people, need to take the temporal element of nationhood seriously. It's like telling a gathering of astronomers, don't lose sight of the stars, or a gaggle of geologists, don't forget the ground beneath your feet. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you all need to pay more attention to the history of nations. When talking about the nation's temporal depth, I'm talking about something more than merely a sense of shared history. Almost any group, after all, can develop shared histories that recall dramatic events and celebrated predecessors: a state, a football team, a trade association. You're at the National Insurance Association convention and you overhear the conversation. Who can ever forget Joe Smith and his uncanny ability to sell unnecessary insurance policies? He's monumentalized, remembered. But the nation, I contend, is not just another group with stories to tell about its members' ups and downs. It is instead one of a far smaller number of associations that are constituted by the way in which its members imagine their shared path through time. What makes a nation, to paraphrase Ernst Renan, is the affirmation of a shared cultural legacy, a shared inheritance as the source of communal ties. In nations, as in families, the horizontal ties of mutual concern and loyalty that connect present-day members are constituted by the way in which we imagine vertical connections to those who came before us and come after us. In other words, we recognize each other as members of nations by our sense of sharing a place in a line that extends from one generation to another through time. That vertical connection in nations is nowhere near as straightforward as the genealogical lineages that constitute families, lineages that allow us to recognize second cousins as well as siblings as members of the same family. A begat B, B married C, and begat D, and so on. But it's no less central to the experience of nationhood. So I'll start today by trying to articulate what's distinctive about the way in which members of nations imagine their mutual connections over time. I'll then go on to discuss some theoretical and practical implications of this understanding of nationhood. If by chance you've seen my book, you'll recognize some of the points I'll make today. My goal here is really to articulate more clearly a distinctive feature of the experience of nationhood that I commented on there. Okay. The nation's community through time has proved devilishly difficult to conceptualize, perhaps because of its very familiarity, but also because of its similarity to an even more familiar form of intergenerational community, the family. Students of nationalism, like Walker Connor, who emphasize the intergenerational character of national community, have also been inclined to treat it as an extended or fictive form of kinship. Other students of nationalism, the great majority, who reject this understanding of nations as extended kinship communities, tend to downplay the sense of intergenerational community as well. They're inclined to treat the nation's invocations of motherlands and founding fathers as a way of underlining the intensity of the sense of attachment being described, like when we describe a platoon of soldiers or a team of football players as a band of brothers, or when Abraham Lincoln talks about our fathers bringing forth a new nation conceived in liberty 7 years ago. In this sense, people will say he's using familial metaphors to indicate just how much he values the work of the American founders. But there's a middle ground between dismissing national invocations of fatherlands, founding fathers and motherlands as mere intensifiers, and treating them as proof that we think of nationality as a form of kinship. Even Walker Connor, who defines a nation as a fully extended family, acknowledges that nations are metaphorical families rather than real ones. But if that's so, we ought to ask ourselves the following question. What is it about national community that makes familial metaphors seem so appropriate? In other words, we need to ask ourselves what feature of the experience of nationhood resembles family ties so much that we keep reaching for familial metaphors to describe it. The answer, I'll suggest, is the sense of passing things down from one generation to another, but without the sense of biological descent that grounds the sense of familyhood. Now, to get at this way, a distinct way of thinking about connecting generations to each other through time, let's consider a typical celebration of nationhood. I'm sure you could come up with hundreds of parallel examples from your research, but I doubt those examples are likely to be described as effectively, because I'm taking this example from a great piece of writing, Rebecca West's Black Lamb, Gray Falcon, her reflections on her travels in the former Yugoslavia in the 1930s. If you're not familiar with the book, I highly recommend it. It's a great read, despite the fact that it's an 80-year-old travelogue and weighs in over 1,000 pages. You can pass many an interesting hour with it, but it'll be hard to fit in your travel bag. The passage comes near the end of the book when West finally reaches the province of Kosovo, which is tellingly described to her as Old Serbia, and she's brought to the field of blackbirds, the hallowed site of the defeat that in Serbian lore led to the Serbs' domination by the Ottoman Turks. And there she hears two little boys recite a poem celebrating the self-sacrifice of their predecessors in that battle, a recital that brings tears to the eyes of her Serbian guide, which leads West to mount a spirited defense of cultural nationalism against its critics. I'm quoting her now. The little boys looked noble and devout as they recited. Here was the nationalism which the intellectuals of my age agreed to consider a vice and the origins of the world's misfortunes. I can't imagine why. Every human being is of sublime value because his experience, which must be in some measure unique, gives him a unique view of reality, and the sum of such views should go far to giving us the complete picture of reality, which the human race must attain if it is ever to comprehend its destiny. It follows, then, that every nation, being an association of human beings who have been drawn together by common experience, also has its own unique view of reality, which must contribute to our deliverance. Here, certainly, I could look without any reservation on the scene, on the two little boys darkening their brows in an imitation of the heroes as they spoke the stern verse. This was as unlikely to beget any ill as the wild roses and meadow sweets we had gathered by the road. Did I hear a few gasps or chuckles at that last line? I always hear that when I read that last line with my students. After what we've witnessed in Kosovo, little boys darkening their brows in imitation of Serbian national heroes can't help but suggest something considerably more sinister than the gathering of roadside flowers. But I think there's a lot to think about here. And that's why I love giving this passage to my students in class. And West is hardly naive about nationalist passions. After all, she makes sure that we know very well that the Serbian nationalist guide, who gushes about our children and our churches and our heritage, is a Jewish intellectual with an unsympathetic and rather anti-Semitic German wife to boot. So let's think about what's being depicted here. Certainly not shared descent, given what we know about her guide's background. Rather, it's the value of cultural diversity, which depends on encouraging the unique views of things that comes from sharing experiences as a group. Nations, in this view, are communities with unique perspectives promoted by their particular and unrepeatable shared experiences. But that's not quite right. Constantine, the guide, and the little boy certainly didn't experience Prince Lazar's defeat on the field of blackbirds. What they experience is, and share is a set of stories about that defeat and its effect on later Serbian history. And not just any set of stories, but poems and songs that they've received from past generations that they're going to pass on to their heirs. That's surely what brings tears to the eyes of the guide Constantine. The little boy's apparent initiation into the intergenerational community that he shares with them. The vertical tie from the inherited tales establishes a horizontal connection, a sense of community between him and them and all who share and affirm this inheritance. The nation, I'm suggesting, is an intergenerational community like the family, but its intergenerational connections are connected by imagined cultural inheritance rather than imagined descent. What makes members of a nation is the affirmation of a particular line of cultural heritage as a source of mutual concern and loyalty for those who share it. Now, I don't think there's anything particularly unusual or original about this understanding of national community. It's pretty much what Renan said it was in the most famous definition of the nation of all. At least if you remember that Renan said there were two things that made a nation, not just the daily plebiscite, but also a rich legacy of cultural memories. But if this way of understanding national community is right, then something a bit more controversial follows that's rarely noted. Nations coalesce around the shared experience of inheriting a line of cultural memories, beliefs, and practices, rather than the shared experience of endorsing or practicing any particular part of that heritage. You can't be a member of the Jewish religious community if you don't believe in or practice some version of Judaism. But you can be a member of the Jewish nation, even if you are hostile or indifferent to Jewish beliefs and practices. For what makes a Jewish nation here, in this understanding, is its identification with people who share the experience of a heritage of Jewish things, whatever one may think of them. Nations are often described as cultural communities, but I think they're better described as cultural heritage communities. Here's another example to illustrate my point. Imagine an American lover of French culture making her pilgrimage to Paris. She has superb command of the French language and the glories of French culture from Rabelais to Proust. But because she's gained her mastery of French in an American prep school and later at Yale, she lacks the experience of cultural heritage that I'm suggesting constitutes the sense of French national community. She may well be welcomed in Paris, even lionized by the Parisian intellectual community. She may eventually get French citizenship. But despite what some Parisian ideologues will tell her, she'll never share a sense of community that's shared by far less articulate French women. Individuals have little taste or interest in the glories of Proustian prose. And this is also true in so-called civic nations, like the United States. What makes the American national community is not the profession of a set of shared political principles, as many defenders of the idea of civic nationalism have suggested. What makes that community is a shared political heritage, passed down, as Lincoln said, from our fathers 77 years ago. Growing up in Toronto or Istanbul or Shanghai, I may admire the principles established by the Declaration of Independence. I might even move to the United States and eventually gain full citizenship in that political community, a community organized around some of those principles, but I'll lack the shared experience of receiving those principles as a cultural inheritance with all the ambiguous baggage that comes with it. Conversely, if I grew up in Toledo rather than Toronto, that's Toledo, Ohio, not Spain. If I grew up in Toledo rather than Toronto, I may have had my fill of this political heritage, and I may come to treat it with a certain amount of disdain, insisting that it be challenged for its promotion of racism, hypocrisy, toxic individualism, and many other wrongs. Yet that will not necessarily erase my sense of belonging to an American national community, as long as I still feel a connection to the people who share the political heritage whose vices I'm seeking to expose. Indeed, it's precisely because I feel that connection that I'm trying to expose those vices and set us straight. I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with us, the people formed by a misshapen political heritage. Now, if I'm right that it's cultural and shared cultural inheritance that constitutes national community, then that suggests it does not rely or necessarily rely on any kind of consensus about what's right or how to do things. On a previous occasion when I was presenting these ideas, the British political philosopher David Miller suggested to me, well, point's broadly true, but there has to be some basic bottom line agreement, something that all Brits or Czechs or Koreans endorse as members of their community. He suggested in Britain, everything else may be up for grabs, but let's say pride in the war effort against the Nazis, the glories of the finest hour in the Battle of Britain. That would be it. But yet, as David was surely aware, the glorification of Britain's finest hour in World War II has been subject to revision, critique, and even ridicule, and not just by academics, historical revisionists, but in popular culture. Shortly before that conference, there was a movie came out called Hope and Glory, which shocked many Britons because it was about the Battle of Britain as seen, let's say, way down here, and let's say less heroically. Let's put it like that. But the really telling point for me here is the way in which revisionists reveal their own sense of belonging to a cultural heritage community in the course of unmasking its absurdities. The revisionists are speaking to people who have grown up with and share a set of stories, but they're not just trying to set the historical record straight, like Rankian historians tasked with showing wie es eigentlich gewesen war. They're trying to set a community straight, a community formed by stories and other cultural artifacts that they share with them. Both conservatives and liberals typically assume the existence of this sort of community in their political battles, and they're both inclined to accuse each other, or accuse their opponents, of forgetting what's really important in the heritage that they share. Conservatives typically accuse liberals of forgetting, or to use the expression become popular in America today, canceling the great moments in that heritage. Liberals typically accuse conservatives of trying to forget the dark spots in that heritage. Why do people keep talking about the Nazis? They were only in power for 12 years. Why do they keep harping on the impact of slavery as America's original sin? It's been dead for a century and a half. I want to make the point. Most contemporary liberals, no less than conservatives, argue in a way that assumes that their audience shares the sense of community through time that I've been describing. They argue this way because they're used to participating in a community constituted by a somewhat disordered collection of principles, memories, and practices, a community that they feel responsible to make the most of. Their arguments often take the form, this is who we really are, the people who believe in this, or are devoted to that, or to correcting that. But in reality, what they're trying to do is persuade people who are formed by a disordered heritage to pay more attention to one thing rather than another contained within it. Now, let me make it plain that I'm not suggesting that membership in a nation is a simple fact determined by the contingencies of birth. Renan's insight about the role of subjective affirmation, his daily plebiscite, is still sound in my eyes. But the issue on the ballot in this metaphorical plebiscite that Renan talks about is which of a limited set of lines of cultural inheritance one will affirm as a focus for communal loyalties. If you're thinking about Alsace at the end of the 19th century, like Renan was, the contenders are a more or less political heritage that you share with the French, and a more or less linguistic heritage shared with the Germans. If it's Quebec at the end of the 20th century, you're thinking about a choice between a political heritage shared with all Canadians and a narrower cultural heritage shared primarily by francophones in Quebec, francophone Québécois. Nationhood involves subjective affirmation, but it's a choice among a limited number of options determined by contingent circumstances of one's birth and upbringing. So let me turn now briefly to some theoretical implications of this understanding, the experience of nationhood. I'll try to move quickly here because I think you're probably more interested in the practical consequences. First, my emphasis on shared cultural heritage as the focus of national community helps explain why it's been so hard to pin down a satisfactory definition of the nation. You can't rest with this that line about a nation being a group that thinks of itself as a nation. That's the kind of analysis that gives theorists a bad name among hardworking historians. Got to answer the question. We've got to, and there's no escaping the question of what in particular is being affirmed by members of nations. What we think we are when we think we're a nation. My focus on cultural heritage helps answer that question without forcing us to constrain nationhood within an overly narrow specification of its content. Nations are distinguished by the way in which cultural material is transmitted rather than any particular form of cultural material. Lines of cultural inheritance usually contain a jumble of cultural artifacts, from linguistic practices and religious rites to political principles and tales of heroism. You don't have to practice or admire any particular part of that heritage to share membership in a national community. You need only treat that heritage as a focus of community with the people who share it. This understanding of nationhood also gives us a reason to look beyond the fabled dichotomy between primordialism and modernism that dominates so much theoretical discussion of the subject of nationalism. The experience of nationhood, as I've described it, has a temporal depth that most modernists deny or downplay. But the source of this temporal depth is not at all primordial in character. It does not draw on some instinctive sense of subordination to the small kinship bands out of which human beings evolved, let alone from the sense that actual nations are imagined as descendant from some primordial German or Japanese Adam and Eve, as Walker Connor puts it. Some national lines of inheritance push back into the unseen mists of time, but others, many others, are out there in the open for all of us to see. In an oath of federation taken in an alpine field, I had to get that in there, declarations made in the course of wars of independence. The nation's temporal depth, you might say, can have rather shallow roots. Okay, I think I'll skip on now to the practical consequences. There's lots of things I could talk about here, but I'll summarize my conclusions by saying I have good news and I have bad news for you. I'll start with the bad news so I can end my talk on a happier note. The bad news, and it's probably pretty clear from what I've said already, is there's a certain degree of exclusivity built into the experience of nationhood that modern society seems to promote. In the right conditions, it's possible for my American in Paris to become fluent in French culture, move to Paris and become a French citizen. But she cannot choose to become a member of the French national community over time because she does not and cannot share the experience of cultural inheritance around, which constitutes that community. That means despite her superb French and equal civic rights as a citizen if she gets citizenship, she'll be perceived to a certain extent as an outsider to people who share that experience of French nationhood. The efforts of liberal democratic theorists to identify a non-exclusive version of national community, a purely civic nation based on shared political principles, or a purely cultural nation based on shared cultural affinities, these efforts are quite admirable, but bound to be unsuccessful. Not that it's impossible to imagine communities that function as voluntary associations for the expression of shared political principles or cultural affinities, but that's not the form of nationhood that's been so prominent in modern political life, including in the places where the proponents of the non-exclusive versions claim to find it. In the United States, we describe the process whereby immigrants gain citizenship as naturalization. Now, it's a peculiar metaphor, since there's nothing natural gained through the process, quite the contrary. It's a process by which politically constituted rights are granted to people living within a set of conventionally defined borders. But the idea behind this expression is that this process brings the rights of the new citizens into line with those who got their rights naturally, that is, by birth to citizen parents or within national borders. My point bringing this up is to say that there's no equivalent to naturalization with regard to national community, no process by which we can remove all the foreignness of immigrants. Naturalization works with political community because that community is constituted by a set of rights and practices that one can choose to bestow and exercise. It doesn't work for national community because that form of community is constituted by a shared experience of cultural reception, and we can't go back and re-experience how we grew up and matured. Needless to say, that creates all sorts of problems that we face, all sorts of problems for how liberal democratic nations deal with immigration. We're aware of those. But here's where the good news, or relatively good news, comes in. Yeah, relatively good news. The nation's version of intergenerational community is not nearly as exclusive or resistant to pluralism as it's usually taken to be. Let's start with the problem of immigrants, the fact that people like my American or, say, Algerian in Paris can't be naturalized as a member of the nation. That may be true, but it doesn't have to be true for their children. For their children, unlike their parents, can share the experience, or at least part of the experience, of cultural inheritance with other members of the nation. Immigrants always retain a certain degree of foreignness, no matter their cultural fluency, even when naturalized as citizens. But their children not only can become members of the new national community that prevails in their new homes, it takes considerable effort to prevent them from doing so. Now, of course, great efforts are very often made to prevent the naturalization of immigrant children into new national communities, both by nativists and at times by the children's own family. But unlike with their parents, the integration of immigrant children into a national community is a real possibility because they share the experience because they can share the experience that constitutes such communities. Moreover, that integration of immigrant children need not take the form of wholesale cultural abandonment and assimilation, whereby they are Americanized, Russified, Sinicized. That view of national immigration assumes an overly monolithic and coherent understanding of cultural heritage. Of course, monolithic and coherent may be precisely how things are portrayed in the national heritage museums that new nations inevitably erect. But in practice, cultural inheritance lacks the coherence of a culture, let alone a national creed. This last point highlights something important about nations that usually is ignored. Every nation is built upon a shared cultural heritage that is both unique and intrinsically pluralistic. A national heritage is unique because it is based on a singular line of succession in which one cultural memory or in which cultural memories or artifacts follow each other in time and are combined in unplanned and often inconsistent collections. As a result of this uniqueness, every nation draws its heritage from a finite but diverse set of sources. The cultural inheritance that allows people to identify with each other as members of a Chinese nation is certainly Confucian in character, but it's also legalist, Taoist, Maoist, and Buddhist, and much more. The French cultural heritage is both Catholic and secular, or civique, aristocratic and revolutionary, and much more. And it is therefore compatible with a considerable diversity of ways of life and forms of cultural expression. Of course, some people are bound to feel so strongly about a particular piece of their national heritage that they can't imagine their nation without it. Such people complain bitterly about the way in which their nation is losing its soul with the degeneration of its mother tongue, or the departure from the familiar traditions or rituals. And they may be right. But nations often survive the loss of their metaphorical souls. Jewish people survived the loss of its homeland, its independence, and its religious center. The Irish people, the subordination of its mother tongue. The German people, the collapse of imperial, liberal, democratic, and fascist regimes. The Japanese people, the divinization and de-divinization of its emperor, among the many extraordinary transformations that they've experienced in recent years. As long as the members of succeeding generations continue to imagine themselves connected by a shared cultural heritage, a national community lives on, even if its members no longer employ the language or the laws or the rituals of their predecessors. It makes a great difference to the character of life in any national community which particular elements of its cultural heritage is celebrated. But the measure of a nation's survival is its temporal continuity, not its fidelity to a particular way of life. In arguments about what part of a national heritage should be emphasized and celebrated, those who invoke origins and monumentalize ancestors often have a rhetorical advantage. The advantage benefits from the assumption that the character of nations is somehow constituted by their beginnings. But that assumption is mistaken. For while nations may have founders, mythical or real, they do not have constitutions that establish a cultural order upon which later generations build. What the founders of nations establish the beginning of a line of succession rather than anything like a cultural constitution. And as that line of succession continues over generations, their heirs add greater diversity and inconsistency to the cultural heritage that they bequeath to their ancestors, to their successors. Different groups can therefore identify with different characteristics and values, yet still share the same national community. Surprisingly, national community seems to have a built-in source of cultural pluralism. So, for example, the Anglo-Protestant America that anti-multiculturalists like Sam Huntington knows and loves and is afraid of losing is only one of a number of Americas that Americans now know and love. Huntington, who you probably know from The Clash of Civilizations, went on to write a book about American national identity. Who are we? And it's how it's being threatened by the growth of Hispanic cultural influences. Americans can argue about which of the Americas they know and love provides the stablest, strongest, and most inspiring vision of their community. But they need not agree on a common answer to this question in order to maintain that community. For the cultural heritage that brings them together hints at many different and inconsistent answers. And if that's true about America, it's true, even more true, of older nations. Huntington, like many conservatives and quite a few liberals, for that matter, views multiculturalism as a mortal threat to national community because he believes that nationhood requires a commitment to a common cultural or political core. But if nationhood does not require such a commitment, it's not necessarily incompatible with cultural diversity. A multicultural nation, from this point of view, is not a contradiction in terms. Of course, insisting that national community is compatible with more cultural pluralism than ordinarily recognized hardly guarantees that such cultural pluralism will be welcomed and respected. As I said, people who appeal to older and more familiar monumentalized understandings of national community have a built-in advantage in battles over how to interpret and evaluate one's heritage. My concern is that pluralists are too quick to cede the field of battle, what to make of one's national heritage, because they don't recognize that plurality is built into the very practice of sharing a national community. Okay, I think I'll end there. Thank you very much. And thanks for your stamina.
All right, thank you so much, Bernard, for this very rich and interesting talk, where there's plenty of elements, I'm sure, for people to ask questions, some of which have already come in here. So instead of monopolizing talk time here, I'll open it straight to the floor to begin with, and then maybe take some of these that are here. So yes, Alex and the person behind Alex.
Do I need a mic or shall I just shout?
Mike.
Thank you. I guess for the online people, this is Alex Lichtenstein from Indiana University. So Bernard, that on the one hand, I find that very provocative and very interesting and very useful to think about, you know, the verticality here through time. On the other hand, I'm going to challenge you a bit because I feel like your appeal to this notion of shared cultural heritage almost occurs by osmosis. And you, I think, are setting aside or ignoring the degree of nationalist pedagogy that this requires. Two examples, I mean, you keep referring to the monumentalization, which I think is a good way of thinking about it, but that's precisely why you can't really have a statue of John Calhoun standing in South Carolina or Ben Tillman and one of Denmark Vesey. The country has to choose which legacy is going to be monumentalized. Ditto with, are we teaching 1776 or are we teaching 1619? That's why these battles are so vigorous in the United States right now. So as a cultural pluralist, I personally am not ready to cede the battle so quickly, but there's certain incompatible cultural heritages that at least when they get the official stamp or imprimatur of the state, whether it be through education or monumentalization, two good examples. I'm sure there are many more. So how would you square that circle?
Well, good example. And it's true, those statues just came down. How long were they up? At the same time, there were statues of Abraham Lincoln around, and that didn't fit with the same narrative. My point being that certain political development made it incompatible. That is to say, now you have to choose. But no, we had different stories as part of that, national heritage for a very long time. I don't think there's any compulsion, intrinsic compulsion, to set it straight. That is, just put it in order. When it's put in order, it's because of a particular political issue or battle that comes up, and there are some good reasons for this to come up. But there was room for the celebration of people who went against what is supposed to be our official political cultural line. So I think that shows that there is plurality. That is to say, there's nothing like a Supreme Court of national culture which determines what, whereby we have a regular process where we try to make the culture consistent or coherent. There are battles, and sometimes the battles iron out inconsistencies that have lasted for a very long time. But the normal process is you've got a lot of different inconsistent things going on. That's how I respond.
Let's take the person behind Alex.
So my name is Ryan. I'm studying at the institute itself. Thank you for that excellent talk. Fundamentally, I wanted to ask you a question related to your speech. Was how do you configure decolonization and colonization into it? My first question is, can you say the colonial experience of a certain community that has led to a certain amount of social cohesion to evolve across generations as a basis to characterize that community as a nation? Because my current thesis focused on the Indo-Pacific Island countries, and the basis for their self-determination as a nation and as a state was because they believed that the colonial experience bound them together, and because of the languages that were developed during the colonial experiences and the education and the agricultural customs and the port building led to them building as a nation. And based on your answer, I'd like to ask that when there are, let's say, fissures that appear in these states and nations over time, like in Papua New Guinea and the Boville crisis in 1990, would you say that's an intra-nation crisis, or would you say that is straight up civil strife, as seen in states in the West?
Wait, could you repeat? I didn't hear what the 1990 crisis.
The Boville crisis in Papua New Guinea, which basically led to an almost secessionist war from a Eurocentric Westphalian understanding of the state, even though the Boville community, in all other tenets, would you consider as a nation in a pre-colonial setting?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, certainly anti-colonial forms of nationalism can be fit into this understanding, especially because the commonality is a negation. That is to say, we are working against something, not only colonial control, but we're also working against the way in which we have been characterized and categorized by colonial powers. But that certainly leaves room for multiple ways of characterizing what we are, what we are rather as opposed to what they say we are. So I don't see any problem fitting into colonial, anti-colonial forms of nationalism. I have to say, I don't want to venture an opinion about the border clash in Papua New Guinea because I don't really know enough to answer that question well. So I don't want to go out on that limb. Sorry.
Linda.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is a question, historians, when they encounter political scientists, or political philosophy, in fact, and the kind of normative element of really your argument. And so I'm always thinking, but what function would this argument play? What kind of role does it play in our political thinking, right? And it made me wonder, so in a way, what you've done is shrunken the time. So your argument sort of shrinks the amount of time so that you haven't got a kind of a longer cultural heritage, you've got a shorter one, and somehow that's a bit more malleable and subject to change, it's more dynamic. But why have national community at all? I mean, why wouldn't you theorise a normative community, political community, a state?
Yeah.
Because as soon as you put national in it, then you're struggling to kind of have this time element. And in fact, the person who comes from France with Proust, in a way, the Proust wouldn't even matter, right? Then there's another kind of basis for her inclusion, because you're not actually worrying about the national part of it. So why national community? Why not citizenship or statehood or political community? Yeah. Because I think once you have the national and you start to cite Rebecca West, the normative suddenly becomes very problematic because yours is based on it's not just normative, it's also ontological in a way. But, the Rebecca West ontology of the nation is so gendered. I mean, she's so into masculinity and capacity for reproduction and testosterone, and it's very historically specific. It's like, it's specific to a kind of gendered and notion of psychology from that period. So, as soon as you put the nation in there, it's a whole other ballgame in terms of normative political, thinking.
Okay. What I did here today was try assume the existence of a form of community that we're all struggling to understand and make sense of, and plays a very large role in our life. What actually it is that constitutes that community? What is the specific characteristic that distinguishes it from, say, I could go on, talk about distinguishes from a sense of racial community, for example. So I took its existence for granted. I didn't actually say anything about why it's prominent in the modern world, or whether, and I certainly don't think that it's inevitable, necessary, or whatever. If you asked my opinion, I think that it's much harder, much more unlikely to dislodge than people have been talking about, and many great figures have, ruined their reputation by predicting that the owl of Minerva was going to fly over the, over the funeral of nationalism. So I resist that. But like I said, I was trying to explain what the character is of something that exists here now. My argument, I guess generally for a variety, I could get into if I were asked to explain why national communities become so prominent in the modern world. There are lots of things we could talk about. I mean, Gellner's points about education, I think, are really important. I think the place of popular sovereignty in shaping how we understand community, I think it nationalizes our understanding of community and sends us looking for this way of doing things. And frankly, I think just the secularization of our sense of time. It's lonely out there in a vast undirected space, undirected time, just as like it's lonely being a speck in a chartless universe in space, and people, I think, actually, the sense of a path through time, a specific path through time, is also attractive. Anyway, there are lots of different things. I think this is overdetermined why it's so prominent. But once we, recognize, I'm just trying here to get a sense of what it is that holds this phenomenon together that we're all dealing with. Then there's a different set of questions about how we deal with it. To be honest with you, my bottom line on it normatively is that as long as we practice democracy the way we do practice democracy now, based on a sense of popular sovereignty, understood as some abstract group called the people being the final authority, we're going to have something like nationalism, and we're going to promote national community. And so, normatively speaking, I think we ought to learn. We need to learn how to live with it better. If we develop a different understanding of democracy, a different way of organizing it in different conditions, yeah, that may change. But if you want to get my general normative sense, it's I don't think we can get rid, of the source of the problem without getting rid of the way we understand democracy right now. And therefore, I feel like Madison talking about faction. You better learn how to deal with its problems. No, I don't know if that helps.
So I had Cyrus next on my list.
Thank you so much for a really thought-provoking keynote. A very quick question. What is cultural in your definition? How do you define that?
I was afraid someone would ask that. Yeah, I used very capacious understanding of cultural. I mean, my term of reference I usually use is cultural artifact. Something that's produced. We're not only social animals, we're cultural animals. We produce variations. Variations on ways to present ourselves, understand ourselves, and we can share them. So they're shared. I have to admit, I probably don't have a good. I shouldn't improvise it. I probably don't have a good definition of cultural here. But what I'm talking about what I'm talking about are shared ways of experiencing and understanding things, which can be reproduced and then passed on to others.
So this sounds to me like theorism, right?
Pardon?
Like theorism.
Oh, yeah.
In the sense that it is shared, which I think would then bring us back to Alex's point about the question of contestation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I don't want to like restart this whole thing, but it's interesting to me that that's the shared, how we define, or how much emphasis you put on shared,
Yeah.
and how you define cultural or interrelated.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, they are.
This is just a briefly abuse of my privilege as a chair. There's this one line by Rogers Brubaker, right, where he wants to tear down the civic-ethnic dichotomy in definitions of nationhood, and where he says you just have to consider the term culture to realize that this dichotomy makes no sense, because culture is this sort of shapeless middle ground that covers everything between these ideal types of civic and ethnic nationhood.
Yeah, it is true. I wanted to talk about political. So I talked about political culture, rather than the profession of political principles. There are shared there's legacies, or shared legacies that are political in character. That's what I was talking about, Lincoln and fourscore and seven years ago. There are ones that are more linguistic, that are more religious in character, more just, can be social habits and the like. So you are right, and Rogers, I was following the same path, and in tearing that down, I guess I got into the same area of cult, the amorphous character of culture. Yeah.
Richard.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Bernard, for a very, very interesting paper. I was struck, though, by how idealist your analysis is, that you talk about culture and shared representations with no material foundation to this shared experience. Now, it is said that before I could speak, I was humming the national anthem of Guyana, and some of the earliest words I learned were "green land of Guyana between rivers and plains, blessed by the sunshine and washed by the rains." By the time I was 6, I could sing all the verses of "From Pacaraima's peaks of power to Corentyne's lush sands." There is a materiality, and this is not just simply a fetish created by 20th century nationalisms, although that certainly is the case, to kind of take Alex's point. If one goes back to the foundations of the political theory of nationalism, if you look at Herde and Fichte, and the way in which they connect the origins of language to place and to things, to ways of thinking about shared things, there's a whole dimension, it seems to me, that has to be brought in about place. And place as predicament, because of course we in our post-steam power era have this way of dismissing the importance of place. But place in a pre-steam power internal combustion engine jet engine place imposes precisely this shared experience of being in time. And the idea of place, as well as the material experience of place, needs to be brought in, at least in my sense of things, to actually giving a kind of real grounded character to this experience of being in time.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I might not agree with you about the priorities. One of the theoretical implications I skipped over had to do about the place, about the role of place in nationalism, and question being what gives the sense of sacralization to a place that nationalism often develops. The green fields or streams of Guyana that you remember. Now, is it the place, or is it that it's our place, and it's the place that was talked about to us, and that we're going to pass on to, and which songs were sung about? That is to say that it's the place of our fathers and the generation, the generations that came after us. I think it's the intergenerational character that sacralized the place rather than the place that sacralizes the sense of intergenerational passing.
Then the specificities of place wouldn't be discussed in the way in which they are in nationalism. You know, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land played a huge
Or the field of blackbirds.
Yeah, but the field, the field of blackbirds is a perfect example. There's nothing there except the memory, right? And the great, you know, the sea to shining sea, you know, songs that you know that you sing, and you sing them in every national anthem. I think get their that they're our place, but what makes them ours in some strong emotional sense? I think that it's the place we have lived and we've passed on. Yeah, you know, so, you know, Barres said, you know, no, wait a second. Yeah, la terre et les morts. You know, that's what makes la patrie. La terre et les morts. And what he was, you know, assuming is that the place, the land where we bury our people makes it sacred to us. Well, I don't think it's the fact that we buried the people there, but it's that we've passed on experience through time and a sense of that intergenerational connection that gives this, that livens up the place. It's not that it's so beautiful, though I'm sure Guyana is much more beautiful than the Canada that was, you know, sung about in the national anthems that I grew up with. But I don't think it's the beauty, necessarily the beauties of the place, the special quality of the place. It's the way in which the passage of time from one generation to another invests some character in that place as ours that I think really.
So I really hate to interject, but I'm not sure about this, but there probably is something at the field of blackbirds, right? Probably a monument to Serbian nationalism. That someone put there.
Yeah, right. But it's not the field of blackbirds, it's the monument and what the monument communicates.
Yeah, I would agree.
Right, so it's not.
A particular version of cultural heritage that is not exactly, you know, shareable to the other side. Or not, I mean.
No, actually, I don't understand. What's not shareable?
Well, it's not compatible with the sort of cultural, I mean, is there, with the sort of cultural pluralism that your model implies, right?
Well, no, because my model implies you don't have to be out there swaving your sword. You're not, okay, let me make clear what I'm suggesting. The two little kids that Rebecca West got so moved by and Constantine, her guide, was gushing tears with. They don't have to admire Prince Lazar. They may not be even moved by him. But they share the stories, they share the songs. They don't have to be, wanting to, follow in the footsteps, just in the same way that people who share the American Pledge of Allegiance may be sort of, I wish this is over, but they share a certain kind of experience of things that shapes their view of the world. So I'm not saying that they have as a result, you could be in principle, not likely, but in principle, you could be even a Muslim resident in Serbia and still be a part of a community that inherits stories about the field of blackbirds. That's what I'm suggesting, to be provocative.
All right.
That's empirically correct, but only if you are considered to have been a Slav to start with.
Only if you...
If you're
a Slav.
to have been a Slav to start with, which then was converted to Islam by the Ottoman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
There is a
Yeah,
way by
sure.
which, Christian nationalist Serbs integrate those Muslims, but it does mean that they're integrated in a very, very particular way.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I see a lot of hands. Let's first get through those who haven't said anything yet. So Thomas first, and maybe let's collect two questions because it's generating a lot of questions. So Thomas first, and Leah next.
Is this on? Yeah. Thank you for the excellent keynote. I wanted to go back to the question of naturalization and your American woman in Paris. We could call her Emily, perhaps. I found that your sort of statement that she would never be accepted fully into the sort of national community, is that sort of a sort of blanket rule across all national communities, or does the content of the different national communities differ in any sense? I'm thinking of the sort of difference of the sort of national identity of the US in the 19th century, at least on paper, of sort of, you know, bring me your huddled masses versus an out-and-out ethno-state. So does content matter at all, or are all national communities going to exclude an adult that has not been brought up in the national community?
Can I connect to Bernie? Because there's so many.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hello. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I just have a sort of question remark. It's actually about what you said about the national community and the community that survive through the interactions of people between themselves. But I have a question. It's if we consider that a nation to be officialized, I don't like this term, but I don't have any equivalent in English. To officialize a nation, it has to be recognized as a nation state or by the other countries, for example, to be considered as a nation, because there are some people in the sense population that do not have a national state. And I just have a question. Isn't this process of officializing a nation through a state, actually it can stop the national identity creation process? Because, for example, when we say the French state is this with this hymn, this anthem, these values, this constitution, maybe it stopped the process of mutating the French nation and the French concept of nation. And maybe this is something that I think it was Hans Hermann Hoppe that theorized that as the best way to respect all the national identities and the fluctuation through these national identities. It was to create 1,000 Liechtensteins. It's because, like, very much micronations that can secede from each other, that can fusion, maybe, and ally with other, and that will maybe, if you think or not, concede the. Sorry, I'm losing my words. How to say? Ally the concept of national ID and the officialization of this nation, but without boarding it. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, one reason why you'd want to create 1,000 Liechtensteins, if you thought, if nations really were communities based on shared belief or shared practice, you would have to continue to secede that way. But so. Even by the way, I don't think you need. Can
you put the mic closer? Apparently, people. In the back.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So the French nation comes in and officializes, as you put it, some ways of understanding the national heritage. If you don't buy it, if you don't like it, if you spit on the flag, if you make fun of civism. Do you lose your sense of, are you no longer French national? Are you a member of the French national community? Is this a requirement? I bring this up because quite often supporters of this notion of a civic nation say that, it's shared principle, shared belief, liberal democratic belief that makes you a member of a so-called civic nation. But they don't face the question, well, are we going to exclude someone who, say, doesn't share the official understanding of democracy? Are you going to require, are you going to exclude someone who you suspect doesn't share that official understanding? No, I don't think that's the case. I think this is a form of community that doesn't require shared belief, which may be why we don't, a shared belief or shared endorsement of a particular practices, which is maybe why we don't see the move to 1,000 Liechtensteins. Back the other question. with regard to my American in Paris, I chose that example very consciously because I was talking about, in order to highlight a nation that's particularly open, at least in its own self-understanding, to integration into the nation. And I chose it to suggest that it is characteristic of national community, that that naturalization into the political community is a possibility, but not into the national community. So even there, in this, one of the most supposedly open views of national community, there's still going to be a sense of foreignness that's not going to be able to be removed. That's what I was trying to suggest. So yes, it's intrinsic to national community. That's my point.
All right, so I have Christoph and Emmanuel on my list next.
Yeah, I mean, you have already this suspicion that historians are more practical people and not so much normative people. Therefore, I allow myself to somehow try to get from your principles, from the, in a way, the mechanism that you described, to some more situated, let's say, situation. I don't want to prove in a way, but I mean, somehow something that we can historicize in a way. The intergenerational transmission, or this being in time, feeling in time, being placed in time, that I find a very powerful mechanism. And Glenda Sluga already said that you, in a way, compared to older theories of nationalism, you shrinked it. I mean, you need 2 generations, basically.
Yeah.
And that I also think very interesting. But a historian would ask, for example, when we talked already about the 18th century, we talked about 19th century, and we talked about societies in outside Europe. Could you imagine that this, let's say, rule or the mechanism of 2 generations is not always the same? That you need, in some generations, you need longer, medieval societies or kind of more rural societies. And in some societies, let's say in moments of very quick social change, it could be quicker. French Revolution. Napoleon was not really in the line of your cultural transmission, but he became Napoleon. That's the one thing. The other thing is, again, this mechanism I recognize. I think it's important for a lot of transmission. Effective emotional DNA, of course, too, but also language was mentioned. And but I agree with you that we don't need to define the content. We don't have to fill it, but we just recognize the transmission. But why nation? That's true for families. That's true for aristocratic lineages, for clans. That is true for villages. That is true for a lot of regional societies. That is true for what was called in the former times tribes, to small ethnic groups. That is true for, let's say, ideological groups, sects. Why nations?
No, wait a second. Back up. Oh, I'm sorry.
I wanted to collect the second one because we have so many right now. Emmanuel.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a similar point as Professor Conrad made. So it seems to me that you don't include any reference to sovereignty in your definition of nationhood. And I'm wondering then, what's the difference between pre-nationalist conceptions of nation that existed and conception of nation or nationhood after the appearance of nationalism that links the idea of nationhood to popular sovereignty? So if you don't include any reference to sovereignty, precisely as Professor Conrad mentioned, what differentiates this shared cultural heritage, this transmission within nations and within other groups? Thank you.
Okay, so yes, I purposely don't include a reference to sovereignty in conceptualization of nationhood, because in fact, I think that's popular sovereignty is one of the things that leads us to focus on this way of imagining ourselves passing through time. It gives us a reason to, to push towards it. So I think this way of imagining ourselves exists is not particularly modern, but it takes on a political significance that it hasn't had any other, it hasn't had in previous eras, primarily because of the emergence of popular sovereignty. So that's why I distinguish those two, but that's a longer argument. Does it take more than 2 generations? Easily. I said that it's possible. And there's all kind, look, I don't want to appear naive or, let alone idealistic. I did refer to, and I should emphasize, all sorts of forces try to prevent, are often interested in preventing this from taking place. What I wanted to suggest, though, was that, and that was the relatively good news part of this, is that it's not, it takes positive effort to stop this from happening, it seems to me, over 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, 4 generations. That is, you have to interfere. You have to say, no, we won't let those people become part of our community, or we won't let our children, we're going to keep our children separate. We're going to have our own distinctive community, and the things may be organized because you're not, you don't have a general, you're in a multinational empire in which groups are, are organized in ways that they maintain their separate communities. Then that's not going to happen because it's going to be imposed. So yes, it may take considerably more than 2 generations. Can it take less? Well, it shouldn't, from what I said. But you do bring up the possibility of a revolutionary experience, a break, whereby there's an experience of a new start, so to speak. In which case, I would still argue, though, that it's not it's the foundation of a new national community that's only going to play out in the next few generations. So that the break may lead to a new national community, but we don't know it. The proof of its existence only comes with later generations. That's what I would suggest.
All right, Grace, and then again the gentleman in the back.
Well, thank you for stimulating discussion. I think there are a lot of questions to be asked about the problems of contingencies of birth from both the practical and normative sides, but I'll save those for later. My question is really that I still don't have a clear...
I wish you would talk. Contingency is my favorite concept.
Well, at dinner, maybe. No, the shorter question, I think, is I'm still not clear from your framing whether this sense of belonging to the nation is endogenous or exogenous, whether it's self-identifying by the individual or an acceptance into the larger community. So I wonder if you could clarify. Thank you.
Let's clip to, sorry.
Okay. So I'm just trying to conceptualize everything that's been spoken of into a practical example. So taking off the example of the national anthems, you take the Indian national anthem, it refers to Pakistani provinces and was written 3 generations before we even achieved independence. We take languages, arguably India and Pakistan share the most common language heritage in South Asia, food, clothing, colonial experiences. A lot of this tends to abide by the tenets of nationhood that you spoke of in your speech. But I wanted to understand, where do you configure modern violence in this idea of nationhood? And because of the idea of violence and the transnationalism of violence in itself, post-1947, does it actually shrink down the time for new nations to be formed correlating to the questions asked? Because even though I have spoken to a lot of Pakistanis who've spoken common languages about food, about cricket, about colonialism, about a number of things, I still do not feel that I abide by the nationhood of Pakistan. But I'm Indian in itself. But by the tenets that you give, I would fit that India and Pakistan would fit a blanketed umbrella of a nation, if not for the colonial construct of state borders due to the 1947 partition.
And put a final one on your plate.
Okay.
Joren. David.
Thank you. I think this is a very stimulating discussion, and throughout your lecture, I was sort of humming not only the Dutch national anthem, but I had this St. Nicholas songs in my head that I learned as a child in the Netherlands, which were very racist and which we are, thank God, not singing anymore, or children at least are not being taught anymore in school to sing those songs. But at the same time, I was thinking of what Christopher Conrad and also Emmanuel already mentioned before, the sort of the very expansive definition that you have here of sort of this shared cultural heritage over time, which is limitless and infinite. Because I could also think of the song lines of Aboriginals, for example, basically fitting your definition perfectly. So I was wondering, what is then the difference between these song lines and the Dutch songs that I was singing? And I think that, for me at least, the difference is that there is some sort of cultural relativism, right? Or at least in the Dutch case, or in nationalism. Nationalism operates in this global context. There are continuously contestations, also in the domestic context. And I was wondering, is this also how you would sort of address this problem that I think is sort of in the room all the time?
Yes.
Is that what you're at?
Yes, I agree with you entirely. It very much involves a sense, very much the sense of this is one of a number of bounded lines, and therefore a sense of culture, a kind of sense of cultural pluralism is that there are different lines, different ways to go, and an awareness of that. Yeah, so absolutely, I think I agree with you entirely about that. That's definitely right. When I say that it's bounded in time as well as in space, it says this is one of a number, and not necessarily the right way. It may be our way, but it's not the way. It's definitely built into this this experience, I think, because it's one of a number of routes on a time map, so to speak. Okay, back. India and Pakistan. Would it still be a nation if it weren't for the? Would it be a single? Could it be a single nation if it weren't for the split? Yes, it could have been. I mean, this is where contingency, contingencies come in. What particular lines are available and where they depart and where they diverge from each other depends on all kinds of circumstances that are beyond our control. We always have multiple lines available to us, and what a relatively small set of lines of cultural heritage available to us, and events like traumatic events like the partition multiply those lines. So absolutely, endogenous or exogenous. Both. That is to say, it's something we affirm, but it's got to involve mutual recognition. So when I said, said the integration is a possibility for immigrants' children, right? They have something that they experience which they can affirm, but they can be, they can clearly be prevented from membership in that community by people who do not want to accept them. All I was trying to get at there has to be mutual recognition. So what I was trying to get there was, unlike with their parents, this is available to them. This experience, this way of membership, this kind of membership is available to them, to the immigrants' children. It's a possibility. But it does take mutual recognition for it to actually work, which may involve more than 2 generations, or 3 or 4, depending on how people behave.
All right, let's leave it there. It seemed to me that in your response to Glenda's Luga's question, you rejected all responsibility to explain to us how it came into the world, right? Saying the philosopher's retreat. I'll just explain what it is once it is there. But then you gave a few options to think about. Although in response to some other questions, it seemed like your argument was more that the idea itself may be transhistorical. It is then politicized through ideas like popular sovereignty, and this is how it becomes so relevant. But the idea is irrespective of that. Anyway,
just let me say those are two separate arguments. One, how it comes to be prominent, that how it comes to be more widely shared. Why it is a national community. Why national community, which, as I said, is not particularly modern, comes to be, fairly widely shared in the modern community. And then a second issue about how it becomes politicized and why it becomes politicized, which is why, by the way, you probably noticed I haven't been talking about nationalism. I really distinguish between national community, national loyalty, and nationalism, which is more than simply solidarity with the nation. It's something more complex, but that's another set of issues that I didn't want to get into.
Yeah, right. Thank you so much, Bernie. We still have a full more day to fill it with more historical examples tomorrow. I look forward to that. Thank you again for the stimulating discussion, and above all, thank you, Bernie, for coming and for a great talk.